Anna didn't tell you that the reason that my first book is untitled is because she's rejected every single title that I sent to her. There's a text stream that might kind of go down in history as an endless stream of no's. I was quite pleased to be invited to speak to you all on the subject of Jesus' humanity and its meaning for our day. But I will admit that it's a bit worrying to give a talk in front of your future colleagues before your first official day of work. But they've already given me the check for this conference, and I've already signed my contract, so they're stuck with me at least for a year. But I'll also warn you that I am working somewhat above my pay grade at this conference. I'm a New Testament scholar by trade, equipped with the standard tools of our discipline: historical investigation, linguistic analysis, and literary analysis. And it is true that Christology, an account of Jesus' humanity and divinity, grows out of our reading of biblical text. But the construction of a full-orbed Christology is often the work of historical or systematic theologians. Furthermore, I find myself in danger on two fronts: attempting to articulate a Black anthropology that grows out of a Christology. I'm in an area that biblical scholars have often feared to trod, or we've trodden there only to be yelled at by historical and systematic theologians. But I'm weary of letting our specializations turn into bunkers. Each of our disciplines tends to tell the interloper that we're not playing by the right rules or using the right language. But I think that it is important that we talk to one another from time to time. So here we are. And I hope it's not pedantic for me to say a few words about the theme of this conference. Why does the humanity of Jesus matter? Well, it depends. There's a sense in which Jesus' incarnation affects the salvation of all who believe. Therefore, in the broadest sense, his incarnation matters much in the same way to everyone. But life is not that simple. I was not a free-floating person looking for salvation before I became a Christian. I was a Black man from the South, dealing with the ongoing legacy of Jim Crow. So when asked whether or not Jesus had anything to do with my life, I was speaking of this Black life that I live in a country that doesn't always know what to do with this dark skin that I carry from city to city. So what does the incarnation, Jesus' full humanity, mean to me as a Black man? And how does that understanding of Jesus' humanity provide me with an understanding of my own self that can help me navigate this broken and divided society? Let me be clear. We were invited in they give you 3 or 4 topics to address when you give this conference. One of these topics was racial reconciliation. And I'll get there, but that is not my initial focus. I'm not in the first place concerned with how Jesus' humanity helps me reconcile with the majority culture. I'm interested in answering how Jesus' humanity helps me live. To center reconciliation with others bypasses the necessary soul work that I need to enter the conversation as a whole and complete person. So here's the problem as it relates to Black anthropology. For African Americans, the story of Christianity and Black anthropology in the United States is troubling to recount, but we must tell the truth if there is to be healing. So let me begin that story by means of a quote from Willie James Jennings' book on Christian theology and the origins of race. Jennings tells the story of the Jesuit missionary Alexandro Valignano, a missionary to Japan. He sees the Japanese converts as very valuable assets to the church, people who will make good Christians if he can win them over. The people of Mozambique, and behind that I would say the rest of Africa, are not as promising. Here's his description. They are a very untalented race, incapable of grasping our holy religion or practicing it. Because of their naturally low intelligence, they cannot rise above the level of the senses. They lack any culture and are given to savage ways and vices. And as a consequence, they are like brute beasts. They are a race born to serve with no natural aptitude for governing. If Valignano can be seen as representative of the people of his day, Then the African slave trade, which grew up around this time, was rooted in the denial of the image of God in black people. If we can skip a generation or three and arrive on the shores of these United States, we find James Henry Hammond, the senator from the great state of South Carolina, saying the following during a speech before the Senate in 1858. Here I quote him again. In all systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. That is, a class requiring but a low order of intellect and but little skill. Fortunately for the South, she found a race adapted to that purpose to her hand, a race inferior to her own, but eminently qualified in temper and vigor and docility and in capacity to stand the climate. We use them for our purposes and we call them slaves. We found them slaves by the common consent of mankind, so everyone acknowledges this. I'm actually going to read the quotes in the footnotes because you don't have the manuscript. So here's another one. This one is free. This is a description of, this is during the justification of the U.S. annexation of the Philippines. Here's a quote. We will not renounce our mission, we will not renounce our part in the mission of our race, trustee under God of the civilization of the world. He made us the master organizers of the world to establish system when chaos reigns. The judgment of the master is upon us. You've been faithful over a few things. I'll make you a ruler over all things. I take it as read then that we acknowledge that the full humanity of people of African descent has been a question from the beginning of the slave trade up through the Civil War, and it was then encased in custom and law during Jim Crow. Please indulge me as I just list a few of these laws. From my home state, the great state of Alabama, no person or corporation shall require any white female nurse to nurse in rooms or wards in hospitals, either public or private, in which Negro men are placed. From the great state of Florida, all marriages between a white person and a Negro, or between a white person and a person of Negro descent to the fourth generation inclusive, are hereby forever prohibited. From the great state of Georgia, that bastion of the Confederacy, the officer in charge shall not bury or allow to be buried any colored persons upon grounds set apart or used for the burial of white persons. You see the problem. Black humanity in America is a contested idea. And I'm interested in thinking through how African Americans have dealt with this problem. For the remainder of my time then, I will examine three answers to the question of black identity. First, black secular scholars have used a particular reading of black history as the basis for black identity. Second, liberation theologians have seen the Exodus narrative as analogous to the black slave narrative and therefore a starting point for black identity. Third, some theologians have argued that black existence in America is cruciform. We suffer unjustly unto death at the hands of the state. Therefore, Jesus, the one who suffers unjustly, is also black. This black Jesus then forms the basis of black self-understanding. I'll examine the strengths and weaknesses of these proposals before arguing that a black anthropology must be rooted in a messianic Christology. This messianic Christology makes much of Jesus' particularity as kingly and Jewish in order to affirm its universality. So part one, black history and our struggle as the basis for black identity. How do you form an identity when it has been systematically denied to you? How can you understand who you are when your name comes from your former slave masters? I'm Esau McCaulley, not because my family can trace their tribes to the lost tribes of Scotland, but because the minor family in Scotland wanted to make a better life for themselves. This became particularly poignant to me when I was actually living in Scotland, and my family goes and we're visiting the castles, and my son says, "Dad, can you find our tartan so we can see where we came from?" One answer to this question of the foundation of black identity has been to put our finger on our painful story and use that as the basis for understanding our place in the world. In his classic, The Souls of Black Folks, W.E.B. Du Bois speaks about the reality of being both black and American as a two-ness that you have to strive to keep intact. He says, and I quote, "The history of the American Negro is a history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, listen, he wishes neither of the old selves to be lost. He would not Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world in Africa. And he would not bleach his soul, his Negro soul, in the flood of white Americanism. He knows that the Negro blood has a message for the world as well. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American, without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in its face. To be black, according to Du Bois, is to engage in this struggle to be free and black in America. But it goes deeper than this. In order to engage in this struggle for our identity, we must tell the story of that struggle. In this story, the struggle for black personhood stands in sharp contrast to the story that America likes to tell itself. But make no mistake, both are theological accounts of American history, but they have different aims. Some Americans like to tell the story of the discovery of an untamed land, a partnership with our original inhabitants, of the desire for the freedom of religion, of the creation of the most just system of government that humanity has ever known. This is the version that I was taught in high school. This version acknowledges the unfortunate reality of slavery and the treatment of the first inhabitants of this country, but it emphasizes progress. The focus on progress makes it possible to look up at our supposed triumph over racism as yet another glory of our country. In this reading, the bad parts weren't so bad, and the glories grow in the telling. This greatness is the foundation of a certain form of American identity. I call it the glory narrative of American history. But make no mistake, this is a theological account rooted in a certain understanding of God and his purposes. In this story, America exists as a leader on the world stage because God willed it to be so for our good. Therefore, any criticism of America in some sense is a criticism of the God who ordered it so in this narrative. To be a good American and a good Christian are linked theologically. So do you understand how any account of black history must begin as a protest on alternative history? Otherwise, black persons can only have a bit part in this narrative. We are oppressed for a while, but finally free. We're the backdrop for someone else's triumph. Black history, as the foundation for black identity, offers a different theological account of the history of this country, even when that account is secular. By denying the providential ordering of the glory narrative, it calls into question the God contained in that narrative. It is atheism as protest. If your God told you to enslave and abuse us, then we deny him. The rejection of the God of the glory narrative, to be clear, is not a denial of the God of the Bible. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist and theologian, said this towards the end of his biography, and I'm going to quote him extensively. I have in several instances spoken in a tone and manner respecting religion as may lead those unacquainted with my religious views to suppose me an opponent of all religion. What I've said respecting and against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slave-holding religion of this land, with no reference to Christianity proper. For between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. So wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other one as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be a friend of one is to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ. Therefore, I hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land, end quote. The black account of American history, then, is a bloody and dark story that begins not on the Mayflower, but on the good ship Jesus. One of the first slave ships that brought Africans over was named Jesus. It is a story of Middle Passages, auctioning blocks, sexual assault, and divided families. It is a heartbreaking tale that makes one weep to look upon it. But in the secular telling, it becomes the story of a people who bear up under suffering. It is the story of the constant affirmation of our humanity in the face of a system that attempted to deny it. Some have claimed that this story unites African Americans in a way that transcends even the Christian story. Actually, this quote here is the basis for this entire talk, so pay attention. This is what he says. He says, "Black suffering has been confounded by slavery, discrimination, and racism. This sociological grid of blacks provides a solidarity that transcends even membership in the Christian religion." What makes us who we are as black people in this account? What unites us? Our suffering. We are those who have suffered and yet we lived. What is a Christian to think of such things? Is it true that the suffering of my people unites us one to another more than the blood of Christ unites me to my fellow Christians? One can see how such a statement could be concocted even if we must reject it. How much kinship did the black slave with the black Christian feel under Jim Crow with his white Christian neighbor? Furthermore, the black account of American history does serve as a corrective to the glory narrative that damages so many. I'm convinced that the two theological accounts of American history, one white and one black, continues to divide our churches. The price of fellowship in the wider community of faith on the behalf of black people cannot be admitting a story that we know is false. Nonetheless, I wonder if black history can function, or secular black history can function as a viable basis for our anthropology or social ethic. I say this for the following reasons. In the secular world, this account of the black struggle is without guidance. We are free by happenstance, a battle won that could have gone another way, a key speech that stirred the populace. But is our present status a testimony only to human strength, or is it something more? One of the things you should do, this is free. Go back to the original sources right after the Civil War and listen to the black sermons and reflections on the end of the Civil War, and they claim unapologetically that this was an act of God. But here in the secular account, it was by happenstance. Secondly, does the secular account of blackness, doesn't it? It seems to acquire an almost mystical quality to blackness that their own secular account of the human person denies. This is what I mean. We're all the product of unguided natural selection and random variation. There's nothing at all transcendent about the human person, much less something unique about the black person. Without God, there is no black girl magic. There's no magic at all. Where's the black people? You got that, right? For the rest of y'all, it's in the footnotes. It's no magic at all. We are all here by chance, and our survival is just that. But if God has created the very diversity that provides the richness of the human experience, then blackness is eschatological. But more on this later. Finally, to claim that what unites black people is deeper than what unites us as Christians is an implicit denial of Christian eschatology, particularly the resurrection of the dead. Stated differently, it requires the falsity of the resurrection for its force. If there is a God who judges the living and the dead, and who sent his son so that we might live with him forever, then there's nothing grander than being a part of his family. But I must move on. The black exodus in the Bible as an analogy. If secular accounts of black history cannot function as the basis for a black sense of identity or anthropology, maybe the Bible as the book of liberation can. Liberation theology, of which black theology is one manifestation, makes the following claims. 1, preferential option for the poor. This means that the church's primary job is that when there is oppression, to side with the oppressed. 2, liberation is a vital part of salvation. God is concerned with the whole person, not just his soul. 3rd, the Exodus is paradigmatic for understanding salvation. Salvation is meaningless apart from the transformation of social structures. At the core of liberation theology, then, is a certain Christian praxis that sees the Exodus as paradigmatic for the church's active engagement in the work of liberation, even violent revolt. I'll have some critical things to say about this in a few moments, but surely the magisterium of the Catholic Church is right. Can I quote the Catholics here? Is it okay? All right. First day. I'm going to get it all out of the way. But surely the magisterium was right in Libertatis Nuntius when it acknowledged certain elements of truth in liberation theology. And here I quote their reflections on this. It is important that numerous Christians whose faith is clear and who are committed to live as Christians, the Christian life in its fullness, become involved in the struggle for justice, freedom, and human dignity because of their love for the disinherited, oppressed, and persecuted brothers and sisters of the world. She, the church, intends to struggle by her own means for the defense and advancement of the rights of mankind, especially the poor. So the church does care about the poor, and God is concerned with the whole person, and we are involved in the work of liberation. The question then is how social and economic justice connect up with conversion to Christ and the transformation of life. But back to black bodies in the Exodus. Black liberation theology has picked up on the theme of the Exodus as a fitting image for the black experience in the United States. Like the people of Israel, African Americans found themselves enslaved in a foreign land. Like the people of Israel, African Americans groaned under the treatment of harsh slave masters while longing for freedom. The Negro spirituals, which I was happy to see Fleming quote before me, such as Go Down Moses, evoke the Exodus imagery and the longing for freedom. It's known for this repeated refrain, which I can't sing, so I'll just read it. Don't believe the stereotype, all black people can't sing. Okay. No more bondage shall they toil, let my people go. Let them come out of Egypt's soil, let my people go. The song is about Egypt, but it's also about black freedom. It is a not so subtle call for God to do for black people what he did for Israel. It is true that blacks in North America and beyond have found comfort in the knowledge that there is a God who cares for the oppressed. We also have a history of preaching a holistic gospel that does not divorce the spiritual from the material. But there are limitations to the Exodus analogy. First, these readings fail to acknowledge that the history of black Christianity precedes slavery. The ancient kingdoms of Nubia and Ethiopia worshiped Jesus without ever having been enslaved. The Ethiopians, those dark-skinned Ethiopians, were worshiping the triune God when the British were worshiping rocks and stones. It's true. Secondly, these readings fail to recognize the Bible's own formative impact on the whole of the lives and thoughts of African Americans. Stating differently, the Bible doesn't only appeal to us because elements of the Israelite story mirror elements of the black story. The Bible and wider Christian theology make certain claims about love, peace, justice, reconciliation, and the transforming power of the Spirit that speaks to the black soul in much the same way that it speaks to the Latino soul, the Asian soul, or the European soul. Slavery and oppression mark the black interpretive tradition, and it informs the types of questions that we ask. But just as slavery is not the whole of black history, responding to slavery is not the whole of black Christianity. Finally, as I read the Bible, and here I'll draw on the best of the black interpretive tradition, it begins first with the universal affirmation of the Imago Dei in Genesis 1:26-28, and the claim in the Table of Nations that we're all interconnected. Furthermore, the narrative of the Bible, which climaxes in the coming of the Son, derives its energy from Genesis 12:1-3. And Genesis 12:1-3 explicitly says that the vocation of Abraham, and therefore Israel, is to bring blessing to the nations. So while the Exodus is formative, it can't bear the weight of all of black theology, full stop. And I also wonder if Exodus is paradigmatic for societal transformation, captures the whole of the biblical narrative. Moses tells Pharaoh to let my people go so that they might worship. Thank you. Somebody read the Bible. They might worship him. All right. The purpose of liberation is the formation of a people who themselves serve the nations of the world. In your Bibles, Exodus gives way to Leviticus, the formation of the cult. It is not a freedom simply to determine your own socio-economic destiny, as important as that is. Liberation's goal is the transformation of life and the communion with the one true God. Part 3, Black Jesus and the suffering analogy once more. Time is going to have to make, I'm going to cut this down. All right, I'll cut this down. When Black theologians refer to Jesus as Black, they do not have his skin in mind, but his relationship to the state. This does not mean that Jesus' actual color is not important, or the presentations of him as the idealized European are not problematic. They are, but that's a different lecture. According to these theologians, Jesus' blackness arises in part out of his participation in the oppressed class and his status as the innocent one who was killed by the state. Hayes says the following: Jesus and therefore God are Black because only as Black are they in full solidarity with those who, in the United States especially, have historically been oppressed simply because they are Black. This idea of Black Jesus grows out of the Black Exodus. If Black folks are analogous to the Israelites, then the Messiah who comes to liberate them must be Black. Jesus is Black, especially in America, because to call him white is to put him on the wrong side of the power balance in this country. Jesus was a part of the oppressed class, not the privileged. Israel did not colonize Rome. Rome colonized Israel. But like the Exodus analogy, this limits the appeal of Christ. Yes, Black Christians are drawn to the love of God because of God's identification with the lowly and the outcast in the person of his Son. But we also love Christ because he is not like us. To limit Jesus' appeal to what draws him near denies the larger claims he makes about himself. It is the fact that God did not have to be like us that makes his nearness irresistible. But this speeds me on towards my conclusion. Jesus as Israelite and its hope for our day. I've looked at our history, the Exodus, and Black Jesus as the starting points for Black identity, and I found each to be lacking. If they are not the starting point for a Black anthropology, then what is? How exactly does Jesus' humanity matter for the Black bodies that move through this world? Here may disappoint what seems like a somewhat traditional Christian account, but I think that traditional Christian account might be of particular importance in the context of these issues swirling around Black identity. Jesus, as the Messianic King of Israel and Son of God, when placed in the context of the wider Christian story, can be the foundation for the affirmation of Black identity. Let me begin by means of a quote from F.C. Barr, that pillar of early biblical studies. When explaining the origins of Christianity, he says that he wants to show, and here I quote, how Christianity, instead of remaining a mere form of Judaism and being ultimately absorbed in it, asserted itself as a separate, independent principle, broke loose from it, and took a form as a new form of religious life, essentially different from Judaism and freed from all national exclusivism. So according to Barr, for Christianity to become universal, it had to become less Jewish. However, Barr and the school of thought that followed in his wake did not become more universal. It became whiter and more European. It was a Jesus particularly suited to the proclivities of his day. If Jesus becomes a white liberal Protestant, and Jesus is the image of God, and that's the basis for our identity, then what does that mean for us? It means that the highest form of humanity is the liberal white Protestant and those who mimic its behaviors. Evangelical Wheaton, the liberals have issues too in their history, but I'll leave that alone. Okay. This means, right? This means that for the Black person to achieve the image of God means achieving whiteness. But this is why Black Jesus is simply a different manifestation of the same mistake. And that's also true as a matter of course as it relates to white Republican Jesus. When we limit the identity of Jesus solely to the things that resonate with our culture, we limit his ability to speak a word to our culture about what it means to be human. So what would it mean to give Jesus back to Israel in order to give him to the world? Jesus, as Israelite, affirms particularity. He had an ethnicity and food and culture that shaped him. The food, music, ceremonies, and stories of his people cannot be separated from his identity without falling prey to the ever-present danger of Marcionism. In the same way, our food, music, ceremonies, culture, and history are important too. The incarnation wraps its arms around culture. There's more. Jesus' words to Israel and its particular customs were not an unqualified yes. Jesus saw the sin and hypocrisy of his people, the ways they failed to be all that God called them to be. So Jesus' words to Israel, whose culture is rooted in the very words of God, was both yes and no. This yes and no serves as the basis for a divinely discerned yes and no to all the fallen but glorious cultures of the world. Our identities then are not closed off from God's judgment. Jesus calls every culture to be what God created it to be. This means that some aspects of our culture will remain while others will pass away. Remember what Jesus said to the people of his day. Here, there's Bible in this. Nick, you're happy. Here's the Bible verse. Matthew 23:37. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often I've desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you are not willing. Jerusalem did not want to remember herself as the city that killed the prophets. But Jesus forced them to face the whole of their story and so be saved. In the same way, Jesus calls us to look upon the whole of our cultures, the good and the bad, so they might be transformed. But Jesus, as the Israelite, is not simply an affirmation of particularity. It is also a statement about universality. God's purposes in Abraham was to create a people who would themselves bring blessing to the world and undo the damage caused by the fall. The Exodus finds its meaning by looking back to God's creational purposes and looking forward to his coming kingdom. The Messiah Jesus, as King of Israel, is the fulfillment of God's desire to create a people from every tribe, tongue, and nation who reflect him in the world. This means that our very diversity, my Africanness, and your Europeanness, your Asian American, whatever you are, right, together in one family is a manifestation of the universal saving power of the gospel. We together under the one true King are the climax of the covenant and the manifestation of God's glorious grace. The nature of the gospel demands that my blackness endure and be visible unto eternity. Ethnicity is eschatological, Revelation 7:9. A human and Jewish Jesus then is the key to black identity and anthropology. I am who I am because my people were created to offer our distinctive gifts to God. But the narrative of Jesus' humanity does not simply give me back a black anthropology. It gives me a social ethic that helps me live faithfully. My goal now is no longer societal acceptability. My goal is not whiteness. My goal is Christ. I have a North Star. And one of the earliest articulations of the theory of atonement, Irenaeus posits this theory of recapitulation, in which Christ becomes man and passes through every stage of life, and in so doing, reconciles every aspect of humanity to God. He says, and I quote, Jesus passed through every stage of life, restoring all to communion with God. When the whole of Jesus' life is seen as reconciling, then his decision not to turn Rome into an enemy, even as a child living under the thumb of the empire, becomes a part of his atoning work. His decision to love his own people, even when his own people failed him, becomes a part of his atoning work. Stated differently, Jesus gathers up all of our failures, the failures of our oppressors and the failures of the people who participate in that oppression, who are your own flesh and blood, and he deals with that on the cross. And that becomes my model for living in the world. It means that I can live a Christian life in the midst of friends and enemies who disappoint me because Jesus did it. Now, remember, Jesus' love for enemies wasn't sentimental or devoid of truth-telling, but it was love nonetheless. Furthermore, Jesus passing through every stage of life to reconcile us to God reminds me that God wants to redeem my black childhood, my black teen years, my black adulthood, and wrap them all up in his glory. It is a call to be my whole, free, redeemed black self and see his work in every aspect of my life. Black lives matters at every age because Christ passed through these stages to reconcile them to God. This reconciliation, again, has this telos to unite this distinctly black story to the grand story of what God is doing in his Son. Irenaeus one more time, and then I'll be done. He, appearing at the last time, the chief cornerstone, has gathered into one and united those who are far off and those who are near. That is the circumcision and the uncircumcision, enlarging Japheth and placing him in the dwelling place of Shem. Christ's reconciling work climaxes with the entire family of God, united one to another by the blood of Christ, not as nondescript members of a faithless horde. We are not Buddhist. We do not merge with Brahmin. Religion people? We're religion people? Okay, never mind. Instead, my blackness, which includes the story of my people, our journey from freedom to freedom from slavery, and our deep kinship with the suffering of Christ is affirmed as a unique manifestation of God's desire to create a peculiar people from every tribe, tongue, and nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Esau. We have quite a few minutes left for questions, so if you'd like to come forward to the microphone, we'll have some time for you to ask questions to Esau.
If you don't, I'm just going to start reading the rest of the footnotes. So.
Could you maybe take some next steps for us and talk a little bit about racial reconciliation? And I mean, that's a big subject, but I'll leave it there and let you go in whatever direction you want.
Hopefully, people will ask questions after this. I'm going to say no to that. So let me explain to you a little bit my philosophy of ministry. I don't think that theologians or biblical scholars, we're not omnicompetent. And so there are limits to my expertise. And so I can't give you 5 steps to societal transformation. That's like, I'm a biblical scholar. I can point out the problems and point towards God's principles. We need our ethicists and our political scientists and our anthropologists to come in and do the rest of this work. So I think that holistic reconciliation is work of the whole body of Christ. And my job as a biblical scholar to say, here are the ways in which I discern the culture falling short of God's vision. A good example of this is like when we see sin in society, as a Christian, I might not have the policy for you. I don't know what the policy is about police violence, but I can tell you what injustice is. And I can say, this is unjust. You guys come back with some policies and we'll think it through. So I think I'm at the limits of my expertise in speaking some about what the problems are. And I can tell you some bad stuff and say, don't do this, because that hadn't worked in the past. But I don't know if I have a step-by-step plan.
On that note, David Brooks recently wrote an article about reparations. If anybody's a David Brooks fan, go back and take a look at that. Fleming Rutledge, I've heard her speak several times, and she mentions the cross and the lynching tree, yes, and regrets that she didn't include that in the crucifixion. Wondering if you've read that work and what you might have to say about it.
James Cone is a great theologian, but he's not the entirety of the black theological tradition. And in many ways, God bless him, he's discontinued with the black tradition in its ecclesial form. So he's okay, but there are others who are better. Who would they be? Just about any black pastor in your city. I'm not trying to be like flippant, but like, you know, like when you would say you want to listen to black voices, they're like right there. And so just go down the street and sit under black preaching for like a year or two, and you'll kind of see. I'll tell you a story. I was invited to the Church of God in Christ regional conference in New York to speak with them, and I was supposed to be speaking about something else. And I had like a brief discussion of James Cone, and then they actually stopped the lecture. We had about an hour conversation about James Cone, because they have a lot of issues with him. It's one of the larger black denominations. And we had a long in-house talk about the ways in which Cone was and wasn't continuous with the tradition. And so there's these ways in which his Christology, his eschatology, his view of Scripture are important, and it's part of the academic world, but it's in a slightly different place than the majority of the black church. And what happens, to be completely honest, is that you get to a place where evangelicalism gets uncomfortable with this privilege and says, well, we need to include black voices, but then it doesn't actually, it doesn't actually always do the work of finding representative black voices. And so I say, if you want to find them there, you go to Chicago, go to Charlie Day's church. It's like right down the road. Okay.
Thank you. I can't help but feel like you maybe should have been on the Romans 12 panel earlier. And so I would like to give you that opportunity now.
Whatever Scott said is correct. And Nick, I think Nick was on the panel too. So whatever they said was right.
Yeah, I'd really
I'm the junior pro. Listen, I don't have tenure, man. Don't get me in trouble.
I see some parallels between the conversation earlier and your talk. I'd love to hear your comments on Romans 12 with regards to sacrifice and power and the black experience.
Unfortunately, I actually had a family emergency, so I was not in here for that conversation. I was on the phone.
Okay.
No, it was true. Sorry.
Another time then.
Yeah, another time.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Curtis. I've heard it said that slavery caused body dualism, soul-body dualism,
Yes.
to become deeply integrated into black theology. Basically, when you experience severe trauma through your experiences of your body, it's hard not to try to separate that and see salvation as through your soul alone. And I'm curious if you, especially looking at Christ as an example of a suffering body, how can people accept that God cares for the entire person, the body, and the soul when they feel immense trauma in their body?
I think that body-soul dualism runs through all forms of Christianity. My doctor father has made his career about arguing against Platonism and this body-soul dualism and the transformation of the cosmos. So I don't know if there is a unique thing that we can offer to African Americans, other than I would say something. Well, so actually, interestingly enough, and this happens every 15 to 20 years, if you kind of follow the history of black culture. In America, we look up and go, oh, I really want to be excited about being black. And so there's kind of another wave of black power. People are old enough to remember when black people were wearing the medallions in the late 90s, and we all became Malik and all of that stuff. And then we kind of go back 20 years, we're now in a new affirmation of kind of the goodness of the black person. So I actually think we're in a place right now where there is, in response to oppression, you think of James Brown, I'm black and I'm proud. And so you see these periodic, what I would actually see in the black tradition, full stop, is when it gets hardest, when it pushes the hardest on black identity, you actually see the black response, and then there's a spike. You can see the spike in the 80s, you can see the spike in the 60s, and there's another spike happening right now. So I would say that in general, African Americans have found ways to push back on the badness of the black body when it becomes overpressed. But there are periods where you kind of go through where we're kind of down, and then something happens that galvanizes the community, and we remember who we are again, and we kind of have this strong affirmation of black identity.
Thank you very much, Esau. That was a great paper. I wondered if you could comment at all on Sarah and Hagar and that story and the way Paul uses it in Galatians 4.
Oh, I just gave a lecture on that. Yes, what's today? It's Friday? I gave it on Tuesday. Oh, I have so much to say. So here, can I just skip to the very end? This the payoff. So first of all, I think that you could be in real danger, because it looks like when you're first looking at Galatians, we're talking about Galatians 4, y'all. So this might be some house shop. But when you're talking about Galatians 4, And you have this beginning with the slave woman and Sarah, and it looks like there's a real inequality, and it's really problematic because one's slave and one's free, right? And it seems like the children born of the free woman are inherently better than the children born of slavery, which feels like Paul is having some real problems. You go all the way to the end, and you get to the place where Paul quotes Isaiah 54. Rejoice, O barren woman, you who do not have children, and you now have more children than the woman who had a husband. You know that passage? You know what I'm talking about. Okay. If you look at Isaiah 54 is a description of Jerusalem as a woman, right? Oh, Jerusalem that's now newly fruitful again. But before that, if you go back into Isaiah 51, 52, and 53, Jerusalem as female is enslaved, especially in Isaiah 51. And so what you actually end up with, if you go through all of Paul's kind of ups and downs in Galatians 4, is not the contrast between a slave woman and a free woman, but the contrast between a slave woman and another slave woman who is now free. So Jerusalem actually goes through a period of slavery in its own right. So I think what Paul is getting at there is that God has already done the work to free the woman who was previously enslaved. So why would you go back into slavery again? And so I think that's at least looking at the portrayal of Jerusalem as female slave going from Isaiah 51, 52, 53, and 54 is actually the key to understanding the Hagar, Sarah, Jerusalem conversation. But that might have been too condensed, but that's at least the conclusion I came to.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I thought I got more water. Oh, this one is mine. Sorry, Dana. Oh no, you guys got a third one? Okay, I thought you were supposed to be on that. I'm just playing.
I also want to really thank you for your paper. It's important. It's important. I really thank you not only for your expertise, but for your graciousness in presenting that and the way that that establishes an invitation to further conversation that is transparent and vulnerable. And I'm not trying to back you into forcing the initial question again, yes, but possibly to recast it from a theological perspective. You mentioned the role of kind of corporate suffering and the role it plays in corporate identity. And I agree that that scenario plays out in a variety of circumstances throughout history. I just had a conversation a few weeks ago with a young man who was writing a paper contrasting the respective responses during World War II. I think it was between, I'm probably not going to get this right, but Romania and Hungary possibly, in how they treated their Jewish slaves under German domination. But it had to do with their respective experience with having been dominated themselves. Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting that in America, one of the reasons we've become so fragmented is that as a country, we have not shared that same level of either occupation or oppression or something that has forced a longevity to our corporate identity. I think you spoke to that function within a Black identity.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
But I'm wondering what your theological response would be to the church at large. Where is the unifying, identifying factor? Because it would seem that the elements that have been previously identified, even that Paul addresses, have been somewhat insufficient to really reestablishing that.
Well, I would say that, so there's two ways you can misunderstand the statement, but I'll actually say it anyway. If we actually believe the scriptures, a lot of the problems would be, if we believed and applied the scriptures, then a lot of the problems that divide our country would be solved. And actually, I'll go all the way back to the first person to ask me a question. There is one piece of advice that I'd offer corporately as relates to reconciliation, is to actually tell the truth about what actually has happened in this country and own that truth. I'm completely convinced that the barrier of entry, if the barrier of entry into the Christian community, on behalf of people of color, is accepting the glory narrative of American history, there will never be reconciliation. Like, that account of American history, this has to die. And one of the things one of the things that I say is that sometimes we talk about reconciliation, it's rooted in this side is kind of wrong and this side is kind of wrong, and then we find the middle. But sometimes people are mostly wrong. Like, sometimes, like, this side is 90% right and it's only 10% stuff. And so I think that, like, to be honest, that account of American history is patently false and disrespectful. And when that is attacked publicly, and then there's kind of this visceral response, and undergirding that visceral response is, if that story of America goes away, what does it mean about the God that I believed in? And what I want to say is the God of the Bible is not wrapped up in that reading of history. The God of the Bible actually has different purposes that are revealed in Scripture, in its outworkings in the world.
So somewhat similar to overbundling our theology with science?
Well, I'm once again, I'm not going to talk about theology and science.
We
Y'all
don't
are
need
trying
to
to
go
get
there.
me. Y'all
Okay.
trying to get me. I know. Y'all not going to get me today. I got like 3 more questions, and I still have a job.
Thank you, Professor McCaulley. So I was raised in the Black holiness movement.
Okay, then. I guess you act right.
And I remember in the early 70s, some of our guys came into one of our Bible studies, and they were like some of our pastor's sons. And it was like this heated debate, you know, and they've kind of been radicalized, and the nation was kind of getting popular. And so, they pointed at the preacher and said, you're the problem, you know.
Yeah.
So when you talked about the Church of God in Christ conference,
Yeah.
that resonated. And Cone, I was kind of raised to be suspicious of Cone a little bit, and I'm actually, you know, trying to open up to reading him and a
Yeah.
value there. But you got thoughts about even internally in the black church how to straddle that?
Well, I would say, well, yes, there's a chapter about this in my book.
I'll have to get that.
Yeah, so what I would say, really simply, is that black theology begins as a protest religion, in a sense. Like, it's protesting a law established by the government, namely slavery. So the black Christians got up and said, Jesus is risen, let us go. So it's literally a policy. So there's an element of the black church, by its very nature, that has always been political and oriented towards practical transformation of society. Now, Cone picks that up, but he makes that part of our tradition the whole of the tradition. And so what makes Cone, when he's problematic, is the totalization of that one, and actually the denial of things like the holiness strand. There's a strong holiness strand going through the black church tradition, and a strong conversionist strand. And so I would say that the black theology in its ecclesial form tends to unite transformation of societal structures, holiness of life, and conversion of Christ. And those are the 3 things that I think mark our tradition. The other thing that I said relates to what you said is that oftentimes we're in these places and people think about, like, Christian theology. They think of kind of the liberalism and conservatism, and that's kind of how they look at the spectrum. But in the black context, like you said, it's not liberalism and conservatism. It's like black nationalism on this side that denies Christianity, and then liberation theology over here, and then you have black Christianity operating in this middle space. And so part of black theology's historic orientation has been kind of to have one eye towards black nationalism on one hand, like Nation of Islam, black Hebrew Israelites. On the other hand, saying to Cone, thank you. Like, and we really sometimes are grateful for his witness in the public square, and some of the things he says about race and justice are important. But historically, we've kind of tried to say yes but no to both of those traditions and find a middle way through. That's at least how I read the tradition.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Dr. McCaulley, I just wish to ask after your perspective on plurality in the church.
Yes.
And because it is a lot of church that emphasize on specifically a culture. Like, for example, I went to a Korean church like the other week. I do not speak Korean.
Yes.
And I see how the church in uniting after their own culture to be able to rest in God, but at the same time, it directly excludes itself, at least to a certain extent. What would you have to say on that?
So There's a couple of things I would say about that. I try to be flexible and not have absolute rules to say there's one rule, you have to do it across the system. So I used to live in Japan, and I'm sorry, that church is going to be all Japanese because there's nothing but Japanese people there. As they're going to fly in some Koreans, there was just going to be a Japanese church there. And so in some cases, and same thing in Idaho. I've never been there. I'm assuming there's a lot of white people in Idaho. And so that church is going to be largely white.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't say that you can just always have multicultural churches no matter what. But that's the second thing. If you live as a part of the majority culture and you're a minority, then your job, your family, your career is always about you adjusting and in some sense fitting yourself into that culture. And for some people, they need a place where they can feel like they can be free to who God created them to be. So it's not actually necessarily a separation, it's a respite. And so to say to a people, especially in the black church, where it was created precisely because white churches said, you can't be here. And for them to say later, well, now we want you to come back, so you come back, and not only do you come back, when you come back, we're not going to pay attention to your music or your culture. Maybe we'll have one black person sing a contemporary song, but it'll still be contemporary. Right? But we're not actually going to play gospel music. That's not actually inviting us to willingly be colonized. Yeah. And so what I would say is that there are some people who can exist in multicultural spaces. There's some people who can exist in ethnic-specific places. And some regions of the world, by their very nature, are going to be monocultural. So the real question is, are those communities healthy? Now, if you have a denomination, for example, and your denomination says, let's plant all of our churches in the suburbs, right as the black people are moving into the city. And then when the white people move from the suburbs back to the city, you start planting churches in the city again. Now we have problems, right? Now there's actually an intentional avoidance of black bodies and black spaces. And so I don't know if you can look at the demographics of a church and say from those demographics whether it's faithful or unfaithful. There's too many contextual factors involved.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, sorry.